On the home front, with all the dissension in our society today, is America at risk of losing our democracy? Do younger Americans really understand what democracy is all about? Do they even care? Well, joining us is Stephen Levitsky. He's author of the newly released book, How Democracies Die. Mr. Levitsky, so how do democracies die?
Well, they die in different ways. There are many ways to die. But increasingly, whereas in the old days, in fact, during the Cold War and much of the 20th century, democracies died at the hands of men with guns. They died through military coups. And since the end of the Cold War, the last quarter century or so, it's been much more common that democracies die at the hands of elected leaders themselves, elected presidents or prime ministers who use the very institutions of democracy to undermine it, which is go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask that. So are we in America seeing that happen? Is American democracy on the edge of death?
No. American democracy is quite robust, maybe not quite as robust as we sometimes assume, but I don't think that American democracy is either dead or dying. What I do think is that we need to stop taking its survival for granted and look at a few warning signs on the horizon.
Well, what are those warning signs?
Couple of things. We've got a brilliant constitution, but constitutions only work when they're reinforced by a couple of unwritten rules or what we call democratic norms. Two of them are particularly important. One of them is what we call mutual toleration, which means that both parties, whatever the main parties in our democracy are, have to accept each other as legitimate, have to accept both privately and publicly that the other side, we may disagree with them, we may even dislike them, but we understand that they are patriotic Americans, they love the country, they love the Constitution, and we may not like it when they win an election, but it's okay. The second one is what we call forbearance, which is exercising restraint in the use of power. And what we have, the troubling conclusion that Daniel Ziblatt, my co-author, and I have reached is that in the last 25, 30 years, those two unwritten rules of democracy, those two norms, which were strong throughout the 20th century, are starting to weaken.
Well, I want to know also what your experience is with young Americans. Do they really understand democracy and what it is? Why or why not?
Well, I mean, historically, younger people often are not as engaged with the democratic process as older people are. It's as we go through life, we tend to become more committed to democratic institutions. So certainly surveys show some worrying signs among the young in terms of their interest in politics and their commitment to democracy. But that is partly just a question of age. But one thing that is worth worrying about is that Americans have a tendency to take our democracy for granted, to believe that no matter what we do with it, no matter how irresponsibly or recklessly we may behave, that of course our democracy will survive. And I think the World War II generation knew better than that. But generation, as we grow increasingly distant, and we're actually quite a distance from World War II, I think there's a tendency to just simply take the survival of our democracy for granted, and that's a big mistake.
Yeah, a lot of those from the greatest generation are dying off, and do we remember what they did and their sacrifice? Now, in his State of the Union address, President Trump suggested that his administration is putting America front and center on the world stage. So is our democracy still a good example to the world, or have we lost respect?
I think we've lost respect. It's very difficult. The United States has always proudly promoted democracy abroad. We've done so for more than a century, and we've done so quite effectively throughout much of our history. Certainly in the 1990s, first under Reagan, then under Bush, then under Clinton, the U.S. was a major promoter of democracy abroad, which I think is a good thing. But it's very difficult for our country to promote democracy abroad, to tell others elsewhere that they ought to adopt democratic institutions when our president has been calling into question the very legitimacy of our electoral process, saying that our own elections, are rigged, are fraudulent, saying that our own press is conspiring against the government and is an enemy of the people. That kind of language suggests that we don't have as much credibility promoting democracy abroad as we used to.
It seems that our politicians in Washington are more interested in advancing the interests of their parties over the interests of the people. So what needs to be done to preserve our democracy?
That's a great question, and that's the big question. I think I would have a better paying job if I had the answer. We need to find a way to overcome polarization. Our two parties, as you just mentioned, are intensely polarized and are increasingly, as you mentioned, putting party before country and even putting party before our democracy. So the first thing we need to be aware of, or our politicians need to be aware of, is that if they continue to behave this recklessly, we could lose our democracy. Our constitutional system could fall into crisis, which would hurt all of us, all Americans on all sides of the political spectrum. And what we all need to do is find ways to bridge the differences, what have become enormous differences between the two parties. We need to find a way to find common ground, and at the very least, to speak to one another and begin to rebuild respect for one another. Because our democracy cannot work if the two parties don't have a minimum of respect and acceptance of one another.
It's a little like a marriage, isn't it? When two actually become one, you compromise. You don't always get your own way. Well, Stephen Levitsky, what a wonderful book, author of How Democracies Die. We thank you for sharing your insights today.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.